Welcome to this explainer on the Cold War. Today, we're unpacking how two World War II allies nearly dragged the globe into total nuclear annihilation. Now, looking at the whiteboard stick figures we've got going on here, you might think this is kind of a simple story. But actually, this era was a wild, decades-long roller coaster of espionage, proxy battles, and intense global tension. So let's jump right into it.
So, how exactly did two allies almost trigger a nuclear apocalypse? To understand how the United States and the Soviet Union went from shaking hands in Berlin to literally aiming missiles at each other's heads, we really have to rewind to the bitter end of the Second World War. When the fighting finally stopped, the world was essentially left in this post-apocalyptic void, and a massive power vacuum opened up.
Section 1. From Allies to Enemies. The post-WWII divide.
Pretty much the exact moment the Axis powers were defeated, this really uneasy wartime alliance just fractured. We had two fundamentally incompatible systems trying to establish a brand new world order. On one side of the whiteboard, you've got the capitalist democracy of America, and on the other, the authoritarian communism of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Under Stalin, anyone who dared criticize the regime was either killed or sent to horrendous work camps. And as the war ended, Stalin set up these Soviet puppet governments all throughout Eastern Europe to act as a buffer zone. That move prompted Winston Churchill to famously declare that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. The escalation of this conflict was insanely rapid. It actually all stems back to 1917, when the Germans put the communist revolutionary Lenin on a train to Russia, which triggered a civil war that birthed the Soviet state. But fast forward to 1945, the U.S. ends World War II by dropping the atomic bomb. They hold this terrifying nuclear monopoly. Then, by 1947, America announces the Truman Doctrine, officially declaring they are going to do everything they can to contain communism. And then, 1949, the world just gasps. The Soviets develop their very own atomic bomb. The monopoly was officially over.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just a military battle. The sheer scale of the economic standoff was absolutely staggering. Under the Marshall Plan, the United States sent $12 billion to Western Europe to rebuild their shattered economies. Why? Well, because desperate, starving populations are way more likely to turn to communism. This massive financial aid was designed specifically to halt Soviet expansion. And, as you can imagine, it left Stalin's Eastern Bloc looking on with some pretty deep envy.
Section 2. The global standoff begins. Blockades, spies, and the space race. So the ideological battleground really quickly centered on a divided Germany, and specifically the city of Berlin, which was stuck over 100 miles deep behind the Soviet Iron Curtain. Stalin wanted the West out of Berlin entirely. So what does he do? He blockades all supply routes to West Berlin, basically trying to starve them into submission. But America initiated this incredible undertaking called the Berlin Airlift. They literally just flew the supplies in overhead. It was a massive logistical feat and a huge ideological victory for the West that eventually forced Stalin to cave and lift the blockade entirely. Still, the contrast between the prosperous West and the struggling East was glaring. Millions of East Berliners were defecting to West Germany, which caused a massive brain drain and crippled the Eastern economy. To put a stop to this, the Soviets literally woke up one day in 1961 and erected the Berlin Wall, physically trapping their citizens inside. This move prompted a really stark observation from President John F. Kennedy, who hit the nail on the head regarding the failure of the communist system to keep its own people voluntarily.
But the absolute climax of this whole era? That happened shortly after, in October 1962. An American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba discovered Soviet nuclear missiles positioned right in America's backyard. President Kennedy immediately ordered a naval blockade, and for the very first time in history, the U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. For 13 agonizing days, the whole world just held its breath. At one point, a Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had broken out, and a nuclear torpedo was almost fired. It was only stopped by a single senior officer who flat out refused to authorize the launch. We were mere inches from World War III.
Ultimately, both sides backed down at the very last second. Khrushchev agreed to pull the missiles out of Cuba, and Kennedy secretly agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. So the crucial point here is that peace was kept thanks in part to a truly terrifying concept, mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. It ironically acted as a bizarre sort of peacekeeper. The logic was simple. If either side pushed the button, both sides would be completely wiped off the map.
No winners, just ashes. Section 3, Proxy Wars and Nukes, taking the fight to the rest of the world.
With direct conflict guaranteeing global suicide, the superpowers shifted their battle to influence smaller conflicts around the world. These brutal regional conflicts became massive arenas for superpower dominance. In Korea, the North invaded the South, which pulled in UN forces led by the US, alongside massive troop deployments from Communist China. It ended in a devastating stalemate. Later, in Vietnam, the US feared what they called a domino effect, basically believing that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Asia would tumble right after. Millions of young American men were drafted into a brutal guerrilla war in dense jungles. This resulted in alarming levels of civilian suffering, massive bombing campaigns, and ultimately a US withdrawal and the fall of the South. The superpowers were treating the globe like a chessboard, and millions of regular people paid the price.
And even without a direct war between the US and the Soviets, the stakes were unimaginably high and terrifyingly error-prone. Get this, America actually lost 14 nuclear bombs during this era. 14! This includes a horrifying incident back in 1966, where a mid-air collision dropped 4 hydrogen bombs over the town of Palmares, Spain. Now, thankfully, they didn't detonate, but it took months to find one that sank into the ocean. And honestly, nobody even knows exactly how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. The sheer economic and psychological toll of this endless tension eventually forced a period of détente in the 1970s. The stick figures were finally putting down their weapons. Well, at least temporarily. President Nixon made these historic visits to Moscow and China, and the superpowers signed the crucial SALT agreements to actively limit nuclear weapons. Both sides desperately needed to reduce their military spending to rescue their struggling economies, which slightly eased up the intense global relations. Section 4. The Iron Curtain Falls, Reagan, Gorbachev, and Radical Reform. Of course, that thaw of the 70s didn't last long. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the world plunged right back into deep Cold War tension. In 1980, America elected Ronald Reagan, and he took a hardline, guns-blazing stance, openly calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Reagan pushed hard for massively advanced defense systems, like the space-based anti-nuke shield they dubbed Star Wars, which effectively reignited the arms race and deeply, deeply threatened the Soviet leadership. So, the real turning point comes when the Soviet Union gets a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike the guys before him, Gorbachev was a true game changer. He looked around and realized the Soviet economy was bleeding dry and the people were living in constant fear. So he introduced radical reforms of openness and transparency. He allowed citizens to actually speak freely, criticize the government, and even enjoy Western pop culture. I mean, they finally got a Pizza Hut. But most importantly, he made a conscious decision that the Soviet Union would no longer use its military to violently suppress democratic protests in the Eastern Bloc. When Gorbachev made it completely clear the Soviets wouldn't send in the tanks anymore, the Eastern Bloc demanded change. Hungary opened its borders, protests erupted in East Germany, and the Iron Curtain just rapidly unraveled. It all culminated in one astronomically historic moment on November 9, 1989, the joyous, chaotic toppling of the Berlin Wall. After decades of forced separation and strict travel restrictions, crowds overwhelmed the guards, literally climbed the wall, and tore it down piece by piece. Section 5. The Soviet Union dissolves. The collapse of a superpower. This massive wave of newfound freedom in Eastern Europe built an unstoppable democratic momentum inside the Soviet Union itself. Driven by huge public demand, the single-party communist rule finally came to an end. Gorbachev allowed free elections, which brought an ambitious democratic rival named Boris Yeltsin into power in Russia. Now, communist hardliners were absolutely terrified and actually attempted a coup, briefly kidnapping Gorbachev. But Yeltsin and his supporters famously stood their ground outside the White House in Moscow, literally standing on a tank. The coup completely failed, and Yeltsin essentially maneuvered Gorbachev out of power by dissolving the Soviet Union entirely in 1991, breaking it up into independent republics. And just like that, the roller coaster of mutually assured destruction that dominated the second half of the 20th century finally came to a screeching halt. But I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. As we look at global politics today with its constantly shifting alliances and international tension, how much of our current world is still defined by the ghosts of the Cold War? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this breakdown helps you see the profound impact of this era in a whole new light.